IVM.
How would you like to be rewarded for paying your credit card bills on time? Cred gives you the chance to be part of an exclusive club of highly trustworthy individuals where you get cashback and other rewards for being good. Now that's a great policy. So don't miss out. Just download Cred and be part of the club.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. As all of you know, every Friday we tend to sit back and talk a little bit about history and stuff that generally kind of interests us and to it what's happening in the present day in the light of things that have happened in our vast and complicated past. Today we have a special treat for you. I'm going to be talking to my friend, archaeologist and musician Aditya Mohanan. Welcome, Aditya.
Hi, nice to be on here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm sure that our listeners are going to agree at the end of this podcast. So what we're going to be talking about today is about this fascinating port called Muziris. Now, listeners from Kerala might very well have heard of this. It was arguably one of the most important port towns in the entirety of the Indian Ocean during the period that's often referred to as classical antiquity. And for many centuries, especially in the early first millennium, Muziris saw massive fleets that would come from across the Indian Ocean and especially from Rome, which have left a pretty significant archaeological footprint. Since Aditya is an archaeologist, what we're going to be going over in this conversation is a little bit about the history of how India first began to be integrated into the trade networks of the Indian Ocean and how it really began to trade with the Mediterranean world. And we'll also talk a good bit about the culture of the earliest kingdoms that we see in the southern part of India, the culture and the political economy, of course, how really these various polities engaged with the flourishing world of the Indian Ocean trade. Later on, we'll be talking about how archaeology at Muziris actually works and some of the really fascinating evidence of this ancient globalization, as it were, that these objects that have been discovered in Muziris really tell us. So without any further ado, let's actually talk about Muziris. Just for a little bit of context before we start this conversation, though, I think it's worth getting into how exactly it was that around the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era, we see a sudden increase in the number of ships that are really coming to India. The most important reason behind this is the Roman conquest of Egypt. Egypt had been trading with the southern half of India for about 200 years or so up to this point. That was because the Indian Ocean monsoon was actually discovered around this time, and it was not long before fleets were being outfitted to kind of use these gale force winds as essentially a kind of conveyor belt to move massive quantities of goods to India's shores, and in return get things that India has always been famous for, such as, for example, spices, usually in exchange for gold. Of course, those are just two of many things that were traded. That's something that we'll potentially get into later in this conversation. Now, what happens around the turn of the first millennium is that this very interesting chap called Octavian, the nephew of the famous Roman general and dictator Julius Caesar, manages to take over Egypt. And what he does once he does that is he essentially turns Egypt into an imperial province that is essentially ruled directly by the emperor's diktat in Rome. And this leads to a massive kind of rationalization of rather disorganized mechanisms that were in place for trade before that. So, for example, you'd have forts with Roman soldiers overlooking major trade routes. You'd have like proper bureaucracies and maintenance facilities set up in major ports. And as you can imagine, all these, and especially the fact that it's connected directly to the imperial center of Rome, where you'd have very rich people with large amounts of capital at their disposal, led to an absolute explosion in the trade with India. One Roman historian, Pliny the Elder, famously valued this at 100 million sesterces, which in today's money would be about $150 to $200 million or so. Now, that might not seem like a lot to us, considering that we're used to billion-dollar, trillion-dollar economies today, really. But at a time when the world's population was about 300 million. That's a pretty massive amount. And it led to a massive change, really, in the way that the Romans thought about the East. It led to a substantial change in the kind of stuff that Romans were eating, the kind of material products that they were experiencing, and of course, it had a significant impact on India as well. If you'd like to learn more about how it impacted Andhra, for example, I highly recommend you follow my Instagram page, Connected Histories, where we talk about global histories from a South Asian perspective. But that's really conversation for another day. Let's hear from you, Aditya. What I'd like you to first enlighten us on is how exactly did Roman trade with India actually impact urbanization and state formation, especially along the southern tip of India's coast?
Right. So that's a extremely controversial topic that you just brought out there, because I think mainly of the lack of literary and archaeological sources. Even though archaeological sites such as Arikamedu and Muziris have been capturing headlines since their discovery, it's actually a little bit complicated to infer things just from the archaeological evidence found, right? I think in a South Asian context in general, I think this was created this environment for us where all of a sudden, we just like, okay, all these things that we valued, that, belong to our ecosystem and that we use actually fetch so much more money elsewhere, and that started this sort of this economic drain of the Roman Empire, right? I think it was Pliny, right, who was sort of lamenting about that. I think you mentioned that earlier as well.
He was horrified about Rome running out of gold, basically. Probably an overstated view. Yeah, but the whole idea was that women with their taste for spices and silks are, bankrupting the empire. Something must be done about it.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, also like the fact that noblemen are sort of spending all their money on fancy monkeys and peacocks and, interesting looking gold figures and fancy combs and stuff like that.
This is really and very interestingly, even an ivory figurine, right? So in Pompeii, in fact, where Pliny actually died, we have evidence of this beautiful little ivory statuette.
Oh yeah, the Pompeii Lakshmi, yeah.
Yes, the famous Pompeii Lakshmi. So
who's not even incredible. A Lakshmi actually.
Yeah, not a Lakshmi, probably a Yakshi. But still, the very fact that she was discovered there, and through a very interesting mechanism, by the way, Aditya, I actually read this fascinating paper which argued that it was produced in central India for a Gandharan, for export to Gandhara. Got to Gandhara, there a little Kharoshti inscription was added to it. And from Gandhara, it was actually exported all the way down the Indus and thence to Rome, which is way more indirect than you'd expect, right? It's not a direct trade, but again, it kind of highlights the fact that you had pretty expansive global networks at this very early period in history.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was under the impression that Bharuch was where that item was exported from. But I haven't really read much about the Pompeii Lakshmi as such. But I do know, since you borrowed Pompeii, there's this branch of archaeology essentially that deals with the study of ancient human poop, right? And you sort of decode what the person was eating, which is extremely intrusive to that person's privacy. But that's 3,000 or 2,000 years in the past.
So yeah, they probably won't have a problem.
I don't think they have the right to have a problem really at that point, right? But they found traces of pepper from the Western Ghat Mountains in the sewers of Pompeii, in some guy's poop, and that fascinates me because you have this seemingly just for the people who live in the area, it's such a normal thing, pepper, just grind it up, you eat balls of pepper on its own, or maybe you just put it in your food and eat it, and and suddenly one day you have these tall, white-looking people coming in, and we know that the inhabitants of South India, they found these Greeks, or what they call Yavanas, they found them terrifying. That's written in the Agananura, right? So you have these tall, scary people coming up to them, and suddenly we want your pepper, and they're just okay, take it, and they're just here's a bunch of gold, of course I'm oversimplifying it way too much, but it's really fascinating to me that something that actually possibly had very little value inside of that geopolitical economic spectrum actually started sort of draining the wealth of what was arguably the biggest empire in the world at that point, right? So of course, as you like said earlier, like this had like massive implications on the polity of South India, which
Yeah.
I think at that point it's also a very like precarious sort of argument that like I'm making here, but at the same time, like there's no evidence, man. Like if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, right? But then it's also like at that point, like we're assuming that for the most part, transactions on a daily basis were happening using the barter system, which would have been very natural at that time. We do find like coins made of lead and gold and copper and stuff, but the manner in which these were used is highly debatable. Some people actually suggest that these coins were produced so they could so the royal chiefs, such as the Cheras, the Cholas, Pandyas, they could pay off bards who were actually responsible for their reputation being spread to far and wide lands, right? Or maybe some people are just like, maybe this was just an imitation token. Like, the Romans were coming in with their coin and their bullion and stuff. And you had the Satavahanas at that time producing a horde of coins, right? So, this is sort
and
of
also
like
the
an
shakas.
imitation. Yeah, the
Exactly,
shakas,
an
of course.
imitation. Because they kind of almost copy that Greco-Roman portraiture style on their coins.
Exactly. Like, looking at the coin, it's like pretty self-evident that this idea is an imported idea. This was not something that was conceived in Tamilagam at that point, at least.
Correct. So if I'm understanding this right, what's happening is that along the entirety of the West Coast, which is now being exposed to larger and larger volumes of trade coming in from across the Indian Ocean, you have a whole bunch of different polities, all of whom are trying to make the most out of trade. The Shakas in Gujarat, you have the Satavahanas in the Deccan, and deep in the south, of course, you have the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas. And so, who exactly are these polities, right? There's actually, even though there's a general tendency to think of this period as only having these three glorious Tamil kingdoms which were patronizing poetry, you actually had an entire constellation of smaller chiefdoms as well.
Right.
So, what really set out these three crowned kings of Tamilakam, as they're often called?
Right. So that's a very interesting question, and I think the answers are also the sources are very diverse in the sense that we have to piece together what we think is happening at that time based on essentially Sangam texts, right? So I mean, from the idea that I got, there's different categories of chiefs that they talk about, right? So you have minor chiefs called the Kirar, who are essentially I'm assuming there's something like what we would call tribal populations today that sort of base themselves around an ecological setting, and they have a kinship based framework, and possibly inhabiting a mountain, for example, you have this chief known as Nannan. I hope I'm pronouncing these names right, because I'm not a Tamilian and I'm definitely not an ancient Dravidian human being. So I don't know what the pronunciation exactly is, but forgive that. So Nannan, for example, is said to have governed this hill called the Erimalai, right? So that's sort of a hill and a few hills dotting around this one main hill, and that's very close to where I'm from, which is Payyanur. It's half an hour north of that. So that's sort of an example of a Kirar or something we call a Veli. You must have heard of Mahabali, right? So when Mahabali gets translated into Dravidian Tamil, ancient Tamil, it's translated into Veli, right? So you have these Veli chiefs also. So now it's not exactly clear, traditionally it's supposed to be from what I've understood, that Velis are supposed to be above the Kirar chiefs, but sometimes, dude, that's a very fluid framework. You never know when a Kirar accumulates more power and more resources than a Veli chief. But where it gets interesting is...
Or when a Veli chief might get raided by another one and end up losing his
Exactly,
status.
and it ends up becoming Kirar, that's how politics works, right? Really volatile pretty much. But what's interesting is at that time we have the three, so these are called the Vindaras, right? The three crown jewels or whatever, what Ashoka called them, of South Tamilagam essentially. So there are the Cheras, the Cholas and the Pandyas, right? And now these are also chiefs, where pretty much like the Veli chiefs, they're also chiefs, but clearly they have a lot more access to resources. And the stratification of the social order was arguably the same, but the sheer area that they were commanding and the fact that they had the power to extract taxes and gifts and stuff from Velis and Kirars and stuff like that just goes on to show that these families. I wouldn't even call them like a single family with like a head ruler. Like, you know, it was not very unified. Even though Vindaras were like extremely strong. We are like, you know, for example, you have this inscription found near modern day Karur, which they say is supposed to be like the capital of the ancient Cheras. Highly debatable, but the inscription like shows that there's 18 Chera families, 12 Pandya families, and 12 Chola families. I mean, I'm assuming some Pandyas and Cholas were left out, but essentially what this shows is that these were like sort of like oligarchic settings that these families were following, right? Probably like conglomerates of families trying to run like, you know, like a sort of dominant framework over a particular like ecological, geopolitical like area. So like it's sort of like, you know, you have all these references to these kings and the names are like super weird. Like you have Karikalan Chola, who's said to have like, you know, fought really hard for his territory and like apparently one of his legs were burnt off and stuff like that. Like in the process, like, so these were like very extremely like indigenous semiotics, indigenous ideas at that point. And essentially it was sort of an extremely, like given like I've mentioned war a couple of times, it's extremely predatory. Like kings were just raiding each other left, right, and center is the idea that we get, because this culture is also extremely hero-centric, right? Like, and if you follow like a particular, like, I mean, Rajan Gurukul really like elucidates this in his work, is that the form of subsistence most dominant in a society, I mean, this theory of course has flaws, but it essentially goes that the most dominant form of subsistence, whatever brings the most amount of food or wealth to the table, is also the most like celebrated or sought after, like, you know, form of occupation, which is referred to in like the arts, for example, poetry. Like, you know, a lot of these kings are like praised for like, you know, the amount of strength they have, the amount of troops they possess, and the fact that they raided and belittled this other king so hard. Like, you know, it's almost like they're trying to like dog each other constantly. So it's like there's a fight for sort of like resources happening within these, like, you know, these Vindaras also, like Cheras against Cholas against Pandyas versus all of them against Kerars and Velis, and like there's some alliances happening, some not happening. So it's essentially you take the political turmoil that we see throughout history of, like, you know, people basically backstabbing each other and like, you know, forging allegiances with each other, but like across the Tamilagam region. Like, I mean, yeah, that's a sort of a convoluted picture of it, but like, you know, it is that is essentially how I think I like to visualize it, at least.
It's fascinating. So there's a few things I'd like to add, and a few things that I would actually contest, at least Professor Gurukul's ideas. The first is on this heroic culture of ancient Tamilakam, right? I highly recommend to all of our listeners that you check out A.K. Ramanujan's Poems of Love and War, which is like a compilation.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite texts, actually.
Absolutely magnificent, right? And there's one particular poem which has really stayed with me, where this mother is wailing because her son has been killed in battle, but she's happy that at least there's no wounds in his back, because all the wounds that he's taken out to his front is implying that he has died a hero by flinging himself into the thick of combat and essentially dying that way. It's a strange parallel almost to this very famous saying that's supposed to have come down to us from Sparta, where this mother tells her son who's going off to war to come back with this shield or on it. So it's very interesting to see that kind of martial ethos strangely echoed in a very, very different society in a very, very different time and place.
Yeah, definitely.
The other point on how on the preponderance of heroic imagery and kind of inferring the political economy of Tamilakam from that, I think is a little more problematic, because if you compare this to the medieval period, for example, when you have much more developed polities which are much more sophisticated ways of raising agricultural tax revenue. Really, the major way that these guys are making money is through agrarian taxes. That's not necessarily reflected as much in their literature. The literature, for example, tends to focus on the heroism and violence and whatnot of the king. You know? Whereas the actual inscriptional texts also, even though they are usually concerning land grants and so on, actually tell us a lot more about the fact that, yes, it's more of an agrarian economy. It tells us a little bit about the division of labor and so on and so forth. When it comes to the Sangam period, at least in literature, we don't get any sense of this kind of thing happening. We don't know much about their agrarian potential. We do know for certain that these kings were going to war with each other. And I think it's reasonable to assume that one major reason why this was happening was because they wanted the money that the other families were getting from trade. They wanted to get a slice of the global trading pie, as well. And one, since you mentioned Karikala Cholan, right? I believe that Karikala Cholan is, again, like, it's difficult to actually establish whether he did this, but I believe he's known to have built a dam or a reservoir that was supposedly expanded, that actually survived supposedly till the colonial period, and then was expanded by British engineers. So what do you think of this idea? Like, how agrarian really were the Sangam period polities? How did they, to put it bluntly, how did they make money? How did the economy operate?
Right. So that is also like, I would like to, I don't buy like the, we spoke about Professor Gurukal's ideas, and I'm not a wholesale sort of, I don't totally buy into it, but he does make some very interesting points. But strictly from my perspective, if you ask me, I think the agriculture was definitely, like we do have references to millets being grown in the region. We have reference to like so many references to rice paddies in the Sangam poetry, right? Around like a time where supposedly like rice paddy farming had not been sort of capitalized on, as we see later in like the temple economy of South India, right? What I find interesting is that most of the times I've read about these agricultural produces of like whatever is in the Purananura, actually, which is like or like to put it bluntly, like I would say, like I found in like the Puram section of Sangam literature, essentially. Puram section, essentially, for like the listeners who are not familiar with Agam and Puram, Sangam poetry is divided into two like general sort of categories. Agam sort of deals with human emotions like love, heartbreak, and whatnot. And Puram poetry is usually like essentially propaganda, talking about a king and his various exploits and his bravery and war and stuff like that. Like, not necessarily constricted to propaganda, but mainly propaganda. So it's interesting that a lot of like agriculture pops up in Puram poetry. And the context is that this, for example, King A sort of gathered together this force and raided King B's property and burnt off all his produce, which is like super interesting and super appalling at the same time. Like,
Very
like I would definitely sort of contest what you said about taking over regions to like sort of get access to like Indo-Roman trade. Like definitely that was a motivator for sure. But also apart from that, it was not. I wouldn't definitely like ascribe everything in a culture to the economics of it, right? Also, like this, what we spoke about earlier regarding the hero cult and the martial warfare and like martial element of the culture and stuff like that. It's very interesting to me is that there's a certain amount of nobility found in deposing your enemy, rather than it just being something that you earned out of. Like you earned a particular, like it would make sense to me if you stole someone else's paddy, like cattle raids. Like cattle raids makes sense to me. Like, but this doesn't make sense to me. They're sort of destroying the economy by doing something like that, this sort of like that's also like one of the like things like a bunch of historians have sort of like conjectured that this is probably what led to like hyperinflation and stuff in the economy. And like like every time someone produced, like agricultural produce was not so a structured economic, there was no policy that governed agricultural produce, like which later became like absolutely like surplus and stuff was totally acquired from agriculture. That went like but around this time also, what we're assuming is that definitely like agriculture is something that's used for subsistence. There's no indication that surplus is being procured through any sort of agriculture. And even like the goods that are coming in from like international, like like Egypt and Rome and Greece and Middle East and stuff, it seems like these were not used for economic gains, but rather than these are used for like prestige. It's more like these are seen as like valuable goods, like, essentially like interesting shit that no one else has, well, like, possession of in all of Tamilagam. Like that is the picture that the historical consensus has painted. And I don't know, honestly speaking, I don't know how accurate this is. And I may have some biases that stop me from wholeheartedly like buying into this idea. But like it could be extremely probable, like, that the economy around this, like, because we also have like a lot of references to plow architecture, agriculture. Plow agriculture is revolutionary, right? That is where surplus is generated. Like you minimize the work and you maximize the output. Plow agriculture is something that's only a few kins and a few families here and there are using, and I don't think anyone until at least the turn of like 0 AD, like, I don't think anyone had really figured out, any king or any ruler had really figured out the potential of this piece of technology that was floating around this region at this time. So, like, it was sort of like a very interesting political economic scenario, because we also like met with a lot of like references in the poems where like you have these bards, right, whose job is essentially like, the way I visualize it, for absolutely no reason, is that there's this dude, probably like, probably like an old guy with a big beard, and he's probably got like a instrument with him, something like the ektara and stuff that we see today's bowls using, probably, or like any like musician, indigenous forms of music. And they write these songs about these kings and their exploits and what they did, like, essentially. So I mean, like, definitely like Puram poetry, a lot of Puram poetry is definitely compiled, I'm assuming, by like bards, composed of at least by these bards who were like talking about the exploits of this king and how rich his lands were and how people don't suffer there, no one meets hunger and stuff like that, like, but there's also references where like once like probably like a hungry bard shows up at this king's court or whatever, and the king doesn't have anything to give that guy, like he has nothing, so he raids a neighboring territory, brings back a certain amount of paddy, food, and precious items, and that is the gift that he has to give to the bard, right? Now if we take these poems at like face value, if like anyone needs references, like, I can definitely provide them. I have like notes and stuff. I don't want to get into the intricacies of which poem this is and stuff, but if we take it for face value that this is actually happening, what does that really mean? Like, this dude doesn't have enough to give to even one mouth that does not belong to his domain, which is like super interesting to me. Like, it also paints a very interesting picture about, like, even though South India had quote unquote so many riches that the Romans and stuff were after, and presumably around the same chronological framework, we have a king who can't even feed a bard, so that really like casts some like very interesting questions about the economy at that point.
It's fascinating, and again, there's a lot to unpack here, right? So,
yeah.
I was when you mentioned this instance of the bard, of the king not being able to pay the bard, I was actually hung up on the fact that going out and raiding, getting that much loot, and then paying a bard was apparently a well enough established dynamic that it was actually preserved in poetic literature. And I think that ties back to what you're saying about why are these polities really raiding each other in such savage ways? They're doing it because they want to get their hands on stuff that they can redistribute. And what is redistributed to? A later Indian king, for example, might have given the loot of a war or to a temple. We have a great example from Belur, not far from Bangalore, where Takshila itself is based, where we know, for example, that the Hoysala king Vishnuvardhana, after defeating the Cholas in battle, is known to have weighed out a lot of his loot at the scale that you can still see in Belur itself, and gave it to the god. Whereas here, in a much early period in South Indian history, you're seeing that these prestige items that are gained through violence are in fact being redistributed to bards instead, which is very interesting. Of course, poetic traditions would continue to the medieval period, but the preponderance of bardic literature and the social status that's close to royal power, but not necessarily engulfed by it of bards at this time, is very very fascinating. Also, building on the earlier thread about agriculture in the Sangam period, right? What is most striking to me is that Sangam literature is very obviously kind of compiled over many centuries, right? Estimates vary like how many centuries, but I think the current consensus is about 300 years around, like on both sides of 0 AD, if I'm not.
Yeah, that's the consensus.
Right. So and very clearly at some point along this period, you are starting to see courts becoming wealthier and wealthier, and also seeing new agricultural techniques being invented. But you're not necessarily seeing a polity where royal power centers absolutely dominate most agrarian land. And that to me again is very interesting. You don't necessarily see that much royal control over how agriculture is being produced. You don't necessarily see very complex internal systems of redistribution, where, for example, such and such villages must send all their produce to such and such temple or such and such monastery. There, these the fields of kings that are mentioned are usually in these territorial cores of their kingdom, and they don't really extend very far beyond that. And clearly, agriculture itself has not really spread that far through southern India, which is such a stark parallel once again to the medieval period, when, for example, the Rashtrakuta dynasty of the Deccan literally include plowshares in the sign of the plowshare in most of their inscriptions, because control of agricultural surplus was so important to them. So all this is absolutely fascinating. But we're half an hour into the podcast and we still haven't gotten to Muziris itself. So let's talk a little bit about Muziris. Before we actually understand the theology of like what Muziris is telling us, just very briefly, Aditya, for our listeners, tell us a bit about how archaeology actually works.
Right. So since we're talking about Muziris, I will talk about archaeology in sort of a coastal setting, not really coastal, as in we're not digging a beach, but it's like this area for the most part, it's about 7 kilometers inland from the ocean, and it's like a very highly like volatile piece of like land, essentially, because there's a lot of silt that's messing with our stratigraphy over there. So archaeology, for anyone who's not familiar with how archaeology works, I will simplify it down like to to a criminal extent. Like it's like way too simplistic at this point, right? Like, so what we do is we dig the ground for things that happened in the past. Essentially, what happens is, as time goes by, soil keeps building up because dust is like everywhere all the time. So the dust sort of keeps accumulating over years and years, and not just dust. Like there's many factors. What if an earthquake happened? What if a landslide happened, and like an entire like city got buried under the soil? Or what if a river, over years and years of sort of the process of siltation keeps happening, and like places that were probably like the small towns in themselves by today's standards probably got buried under the soil, So what we do is we sort of look at historical texts, and we sort of look at geographical features to try and understand where people must have lived. So archaeology is essentially we dig the ground for people to like see how people used to like work. If you're digging the ground for dinosaurs, you're a paleontologist. If you're digging the ground just to understand how like the earth works, you're a geologist. So our digging is essentially happening particularly because we want to understand things that the historical text won't tell you. Like the Mahabharata will tell you how like Pandavas and Kauravas fought and stuff like that, and it'll tell you about the weapons and stuff like that. But the Mahabharata won't tell you about what did like an average person's house look like back then? What was the social order back then? What kind of pottery were they producing? What kind of food were they consuming on average? What was the technological level of advancement like, and stuff like that? So real life questions. We want to understand what people like me and you lived like back in the day. Like that's why we do archaeology. And essentially it's a destructive science. Once you dig the ground, you can't just put the soil back on top and be like, hey, like it's fine. Because we're not just digging the ground to like expose what's under the ground. We're digging the ground to understand like every layer. Every layer is important and it tells a story on its own, right? So for example, if like you reach something we call sterile soil. Once you reach sterile soil, you know that there is no human inhabitation beyond that sterile soil. So we look at it from a top to down perspective. So when you're looking at the ground and you dig like the first few centimeters, that is the most recent past that's available to you physically. And the deeper you go, the more distant the past gets. Not necessarily though. And that this not necessarily is important because digging in a place Pattinam, which is what we conjecture for the most part is Muziris today. It's a heavily like there's a river nearby and the oceans nearby. So the land is extremely volatile. Like sometimes when floods happen, older layers can come back on top, and we can assume that how are we finding Roman pottery until just 500 years ago? Maybe we're not. Maybe the stratigraphy is all messed up because of a flood. Things like that are very real. So we take things like that into account. We account for all those things, and it's also like we look for traces of whatever plants they were using back in the day, whatever chemicals they were using back in the day. So it's like a very interesting, intricate science. It's very different from history, very different from anthropology, and sort of gives you some very concrete answers and leaves you with some very open-ended questions. So that is essentially how archaeology works.
Okay. All right, so that's absolutely fascinating, Aditya. So, a lot of what you've touched upon, especially silt covering up layers and layers of historical material, I think is going to be interesting to kind of uncover that in the context of Muziris. So, can you tell us a little bit about what's really been discovered in Muziris over the last few decades? What actual materials have we found, and what have they told us about, as you said, how people like you and I actually lived in those times in that particular city?
Right. Okay, so I will start off about the site itself, and I would like to speak a little bit about the current social dynamics regarding Muziris, as we call it, before I get into the site and the material culture itself. It's still a conjecture that Muziris has been found. I would like to say that at the outset. I don't think there's any way right now, based on the evidence we have right now, that we can say that this site is Muziris. Now, and I would like to get into that right now as to why. Right. So this area we're talking about is called Pattinam. Now, Pattinam is a very interesting name, and this is also one of the reasons why this is the most worthy candidate of possibly being Muziris. Right. Pattinam, the word Pattinam, is something that's been used in India in Prakrit and stuff like that a lot. It's there in the Arthashastra also. The word Pattinam is used for a port, right? So you say Kaveri Pattinam, that's the port on the banks of the Kaveri, right? So Muziris, the name itself is Greek. It's from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a text that was written by an unknown sailor roughly around the turn of the 1st century AD and stuff. And he refers to this place as Muziris. Now there is a problem. Okay, because this all of the questions that are being asked in an academic background and in media and stuff like that about Muziris is being asked as in what is the relation that Muziris has to Rome? Not about who are we. What were we doing here? What was happening here? These are the most fundamental formative questions we should be asking, right?
As always, I'm more interested in what the white people in India were doing as compared to what actual Indians were doing.
Exactly. Today, there's also still a sense of lingering Eurocentrism among, and particularly, I would say Kerala media, especially Kerala academia, I wouldn't say that so much because this question has been raised.
The whole country was going nuts when the current US vice president the vice president candidate turned out to be of Indian origin, right? The entire country was busy trying to claim them for India. Whatever. But that's a rant for a whole other day.
It's a total rant, but it's completely invaluable to our own identity to measure the weight of our identity vis-a-vis the identity of the Romans, right? So having said that, I would like to sort of transition into Pattinam. Pattinam, it's very interesting because you read the Arthashastra, is so old, about roughly give and take 2000 years. That text mentions the word Pattinam for a port, and to this day, 2021, the place is still called Pattinam. which is like just like blows my mind, right?
Pretty
Yeah.
nuts.
So like in like Sangamira, like the name Muziris comes from Muchiri Pattinam, right? Like and like it's very unclear why was named that. We have no idea. We don't even know if this is the place. So like talking about why it was named that is totally like it's unnecessary. So having said that, Pattinam is a very, very, very interesting site. It's a small, tiny hamlet. It's very close to Kodungalur. It's about half an hour from Kodungalur. It's about an hour north from Kochi. And it's a very interesting place because when we look at the stratigraphy starts from about roughly 1000 BCE.
What?
Yeah, I'm not even making this up.
So you're telling me this site has essentially a continuous occupation history of nearly 3,300 years.
Yeah, roughly like 3,000 years, give or take. Like the site has seen almost constant inhabitation.
Nuts.
Constant. That's like, it's nuts, and it's also a little irritating because every time we want to dig somewhere, we gotta go and beg people like, hey, can I dig in your backyard? Like, I promise nothing will happen to your property. Like, you know, and like, you know, these are people who are not very much like aware of like, you know, I mean, who even cares about archaeology in India for the most part, right? It's only a few people like me and you who are really into this stuff, right? So these people, of course, don't know like what's happening in like you know, what is the government, like most people are just afraid that the government's going to seize their lands and make it into like an archaeological site or a museum or something, which they won't do, like, you know. But still, like, there's a lot of like dealing with that, and you can literally dig anywhere. I'm not even making this up. Just like go to some dude's backyard, dig there, and you'll probably start finding like Roman coins and intaglios and like pottery from Middle East and like Chinese porcelain and stuff like that. Like, it's like astounding. Like, and it's also extremely intimidating because like there's so much material evidence that's found there, and the stratigraphy is so daunting to like, you know, handle. So like it's and like, I mean, if you look at the stratigraphy, I think one thing we understand is that this place was definitely connected to the ocean. Maybe not directly, but like, you know, in Kerala you see this very cute thing, you know, it's like you see these small like streams, like, you know, that tie into bigger rivers, and that bigger river eventually flows into the ocean, and there's like thousands of these. If you go towards like Kochi side, it's like a normal site for everybody, like people on boats, just like, you know, maybe like drinking away and eating some beef or something, you know, something like that. Like, it's like a pastime. Like, you know, there's so many boats all the time, everywhere. Which is what's interesting is that all of this is happening around this extremely volatile river known as the Periyar. So now you must have heard of the floods and stuff, right? That happened in 2018 and 19 and stuff like that.
Yeah.
This is essentially, we're talking about the Periyar river that flooded once again. And this river continually like keeps flooding throughout history. So like if you look at the course of the river, which descends from the Western Ghat mountains, which like sort of divides Kerala and Tamil Nadu, and flows westwards towards the Arabian Sea, right? This river is so volatile, changes its course every few years. It's honestly like, it's not funny, like, you know. And it's like in Pattinam, clearly there were a few inlets and a few streams, at least, if not the river itself, that flowed like literally where Pattinam is today. But today, if you see, as of today, the river is about 6 to 7 kilometers away from where Pattinam is. So yeah, the river had this very interesting volatile course throughout history that kept changing, and sort of also had like an extremely instrumental geopolitical impact, right? Like, we saw the fall and rise of nations at multiple points through history. And also, like, trade was definitely like, we're assuming that Muziris later stopped becoming such a prestigious center for trade because of changes in the course of the Periyar. But what's interesting is that today there's literally nowhere nearby Muziris or like Pattinam is there a river, right? It's literally about 6 to 7 kilometers away is where like the river flows today. So to think that the river had channels and inlets and stuff near Pattinam today is just like a little crazy. Like, you ask anyone from Pattinam, they'll be like, oh, there's no water body nearby. Like, the beach is about 20 minutes away. But like, what is interesting is that when we dug a few years ago, about 2016, 17, if I'm not wrong, we found a canoe. There was sort of, and it's very interesting how a canoe was still intact. It was dated to about 2,000 years ago, roughly 100 BC to 100
Wow.
AD. Wood surviving that long is absolutely unheard of. In very rare
Yeah, it's
cases,
nuts.
yeah, exactly, right? Like it is like definitely like anyone who hears about it is just like a little taken aback because it's wood, organic material doesn't survive that long. But what's interesting is that I think maybe like there was a layer of clay because they found the canoe alongside a wharf. Now a wharf over there is sort of a nail in the coffin because like wharfs are only situated immediately adjacent to like water bodies. So why was there a wharf over
Hmm.
there? And like
There
immediately.
must have been, the river must have been there.
Exactly. So like, and when we dig, we find heavy amounts of silt, right? Where the like where the canoe is found. So it's very interesting because I mean, like the wood survived that long either because of the clay that was used to make the wharf that could have acted like as a protective layer, or maybe the soil had so much saline content that microbial action was very limited in that part of the soil because it was only like partially decayed. And it was made from wood, like the wood that was used to make, I forget the scientific name of it, but like the wood that was used to make the canoe is something that's found around even today. Like, it is expensive to make. It requires a very particular kind of skill set to make. But like, it's interesting to know that this very particular skill set that we see even today, there's only a particular class and caste of people that can make this kind of boat. It's nice to know that that skill set is actually like at least 2,000 years old based on like, and
Wow.
that's like a nail in the coffin. It's not even a conjecture because we found it. So like definitely was happening back in the day,
Fascinating.
Yeah. And we also like through like there was like there's this way of analyzing like sort of like atomic compound, not like sort of like compounds in the soil and like in the wood and stuff like that. Like we use like an XRF machine that sort of like gives us like the chemical composition of whatever the soil or the wood and stuff is, or whatever artifact you want to look at that time. Can even be ivory and stuff like that. So they like found extremely interesting results, right? Like we found the boat was evidently carrying a bunch of products back and forth, possibly from the main center of trade to the center of produce, is what we're assuming. And the analysis showed that the boat was carrying these products, but not. It could be more products at different times, but these are definitely like, there was black pepper, there was cardamom, there was rice, wheat, there was coconut fronds, coconut shells, areca nut, bamboo pieces, green grams, mango seeds, Indian gooseberry, which is amla essentially. And we also found like remnants of like decayed rope that was probably used to like tie the boat to the wharf. So it's like remarkably similar to what we see today. Like,
wow.
Yeah.
This is so absolutely incredible to me because essentially what this means is that at that point the river was essentially being used as a maritime highway of sorts, right? So you would have stuff that was coming from inland to this port, and you'd also have ships coming from across the seas to the same port, and you would probably have had some pretty impressive kind of warehousing facilities, commercial exchange centers, some kind of like rudimentary governance apparatus. You would have had a presence of merchants from West Asia as well as from India. And of course, you need to have a considerable population to actually support activities like this. You need to have a considerable population of agriculturalists, and I assume that were they also importing food from elsewhere in order to sustain a commercial hub of this density?
I mean, like, absolutely agree with like most of what you said there. Like, I mean, the import of food and the import of these products is like, it's not like, you find pepper growing randomly around Kerala, right? Pepper's
exactly.
mainly found in the Western Ghat hills. Like, that is the mountain ranges where like most of the peppers produce even today, like, and it's mentioned in the Periplus also that like, you have people bringing pepper down from the Western Ghat mountains down to Muziris, and that's where like the Romans and the Greeks and stuff, they want to buy that stuff, So that also sort of, I mean, like a lot of people have like, R. Champaka Lakshmi and Rajan Gurukul, Keshan Vilatat, they've all like bought out these factor, like they try to factor this in, but it's just like no matter how nuanced and complicated the discussion goes, like I just don't understand how like transactions as sort of like nuanced as this, because you need heavy social stratification, you need massive division of labor. Who's responsible for collecting the pepper? Who's responsible for bringing it down? Once you do bring it down, who's responsible for the maintenance of it, and who's responsible for selling it? And even when selling, who decides how much, for example, gold goes for how much of pepper? Like, how did they come to that kind of like, what are the units of measurement there? Who's deciding the values? These are questions that are still like relatively extremely unanswered, and sort of still like cast doubt into like, was this region something that was only particularly dealing in barter system trade? Because like I'm sure they had their own like methods of evaluating the values of different products and goods and stuff like that. And so many products, like, I mean, for example, like Periplus also mentions that you had silk that was being traded at Muziris. And I would say, like, let's take a very safe date. Let's take like 300 AD, right? Like they were coming here for silk around 300 AD, for example. It's not safe for the Romans, as we know, but it's safe for us, right? So silk was being bought from China. Now, who was buying the silk in South India that was coming from China? And how was that trade happening? Well, it
is truly incredible to think about, right? Because at least when it comes to trade with Rome, the mechanism through which it was happening. It was happening because the monsoon was well understood. You know how to harvest its swells and kind of come to this particular location. But in order to get goods from China to India, you have to get around some pretty complex geography through Southeast Asia. And it's not necessarily that a direct trade was happening, but probably kind of networks of relays, right? They were moving goods from point A to point B to point C. And then through a series of exchanges, it was ending up in India. And these are very, very complex transactions. As you said a little earlier, like it's very interesting to think about how these transactions were actually happening. How were they evaluating the goods that were coming from such vast distances and being and changing hands so many different times? It's really, really incredible to think about, right? So they're doing all this without the benefit of modern technology, without being able to know the prices in the other part of the world in the same minute or the same hour by checking them. And through a lot of daring, you can imagine that you actually have merchants who are entering new markets for the first time, interacting with new peoples, learning new languages. And it's a very, very interesting time in global history, right? Because this is all happening at the same time as Buddhism also spreading into Southeast Asia and reaching China, not just through Central Asia, but also through traders through Southeast Asia and so on. And like you can imagine that Muziris was part of really these very complex processes that are spanning a significant chunk of Afro-Eurasia.
It's like a massive network of like...
Exactly. Fascinating.
Yeah, it definitely is.
But tell us more about like what is actually discovered. A little earlier, you said that we've discovered stuff in Muziris, that we've discovered Chinese, Arab stuff. So I'm assuming that's mostly from the medieval period. But what Roman goods have we found in Muziris? Since that, of course, is the question that most media outlets are so obsessed with.
Yeah. So, I mean, to sort of clarify this a little bit, like the chronological framework is a little important, right? Like, so when we like look at architectural features, we look at basic like rudimentary pottery that's locally produced and stuff. Those are the oldest sort of features that we find here. That goes back to about 800 BC, 1000 BCE, and then slowly around I would say like. I like to pick like an optimistic date. So I would say about 300 BC roughly is when we start getting goods from the Mediterranean, really, like, and there's also some skeletal evidence of like a person who probably migrated and died here from the Mediterranean, because like that's what his DNA like analysis showed us. But it's like we have these... Yeah, it's like incredible, right? So we have a bunch of these artifacts that start popping up about 300 BC roughly, 200 BC, and goes up to about 500 BC until like, whenever you want to date the collapse of the Roman Empire and whatever that means to you, because to trade, the collapse of the Roman Empire means like a very different thing than like the actual like fall of like the Roman Empire at the hands of the Huns or whatever you want to call it. Like, because like I mean,
Yeah,
all,
that's really a debate for a whole other
that's
day.
a whole other debate, right? Because like the Byzantines could also classify as Romans for you, for example.
Exactly.
So we have a bunch of very interesting finds. Like you have Roman luxury tableware. You have Roman coins. You have sort of like Roman incense. They're bringing in like coal that you like, put on the ice, kanmashi as they call it today. And they have a bunch of like precious metals, precious stones, some iron artifacts, and a extremely high amount of amphorae, which is for listeners who are not familiar with what amphorae means, they this sort of like this. If you think about it, it's like
Like the kind of so imagine a jar, but it's pointy at the end.
yeah, it's pointy at the end, and it's got two handles on the top. And you can't like keep it down like you would keep an ordinary pot. It's like you have to like sort of like dig a hole in the ground and then sort of like place it down. It's that kind of a thing. But mainly amphorae were used to store wine and other kinds of liquids, but mainly wine. If you found amphorae not in Rome, just I would say like just off the book, just assume that it's for wine, right? Because like that's one of the major like items of export. So and wine was definitely something that like sura, like that's what the ancient Indians for the most part called it, I guess. It's very interesting because like you have lots of, oh my god, so many, like it's like commonplace, like I mean, like I'm gonna get into like a little bit of a gruesome detail, but like just to say how many amphorae we found this. Like once, like there was this dog who died, like it was a stray dog. We want to give him like a decent like goodbye, So we were basically digging him a grave, and so many amphorae pieces kept popping up. Oh my god, right? Like so many amphorae pieces, and that keeps like I kept asking myself that why are there so many amphorae here? Like what were they doing here? I mean, definitely they bought so much wine over here because like let's face it, Malus love to drink, right? Like testified. But also like so much wine was coming in. How was it being stored? Like, do you have these warehouses with people? Like, I mean, it's like from a few texts, we do know that like, Romans sent guards. So can we assume like there probably existed like a warehouse where you had these thousands of amphorae with so much like wine stored in them? And like it's just very interesting, like the security that goes into it, the units of measurement thing that we spoke about earlier, like how much wine is being sold for how much of whatever product that you're trading it with, like and how is it being consumed and what is the effect like, and what happens to like the amphorae once they're like you're done trading. Like, do you just break it off and leave it, or do you just take it back? Like I mean, so it's just a very like interesting like thing to think about, because like you probably had like wine industries, like
exactly,
like actual massive warehouses with like, and we do know that traders existed at that time as well, like individual families that would trade, like not just trading at the behest of a king. The king probably sort of like taxed you a little bit for like what you were selling and buying, but not like in the sense that you had a certain sort of autonomy as a trader. So some, like I do wonder sometimes that whether like there were a few traders who sort of showed up with like a buttload of wine, and they just like stored it for a while, sold it off, made a little bit of profit off of it, and like but like what really like I ask myself a lot is that how was this trade happening? What were they getting in exchange for this wine? Like what was the sort of advertising like, because like you have local toddy and stuff as well that people already at that time were drinking, and we know that it was mentioned in the Sangamira text also. So that versus this, like how did that play into the class dynamics of that time? Were you seeing, like, I mean, we do know that if you want to like buy like imported products, you would have had to have certain amount of capital that's like like, I mean, basically you have to be an elite person, like belonging to like an elite structure of the society. So like, was toddy something that was looked down upon after the advent of wine? Like, there's all these sorts of questions about, like, what was the unit of measurement like, because like maybe like the trade of toddy was happening based on a particular, like, value system, which the Romans were probably not used to dealing with, like, so what if like they had to like translate their units of measurement into our units of measurement at that time? Like, what if like they had to sort of selling wine, like, in a few, like, maybe like selling like, 2 liters in a pot, because that's what toddy sellers usually buy in, like, that's maybe that's how wholesale works at that time, like, so it's just very interesting, like maybe the Romans had to translate their units of measurement into our understanding also, like, to make it like more like viable for people to buy. And maybe just like the class element and like the fact that people who don't belong to like upper classes, for the most part, like at least that we see, even like the way Sanskritization and stuff happens, they sort of like trying to reach up the social ladder. So maybe what if like, they were people actually trying to like buy wine and try to decode wine, create wine in their own way to sort of like, try to betray their social status in that way. So there's a lot of questions that wine itself asks. And given the amount of amphorae, I'm pretty certain, even in Arikamedu, there's so many amphorae, like a lot of people just conjecture that was also like, probably like in Tamil Nadu, that was the industry of imported wine. And probably Muziris or Pattinam could be like, where, which could have been like the wine industry in Kerala, like, So I mean, that alone is like a topic that could be spoken about for like days.
Wow. I mean, I've just been quiet through most of this because I'm just in awe at like just the sheer implications of all of this, right? Because we know a substantial amount of like what the Roman perspective was for a whole bunch of different reasons, partly archaeology, partly better preservation of texts. But the Romans put a lot of effort into the India trade. It's the scale of it is honestly mind-boggling, right? So we are talking about hundreds of ships that are coming across every single year, all carrying dozens of tons of goods, hundreds, if not thousands of amphorae. And what we're discovering, what you're describing, Aditya, at Pattinam is just really just a fraction of all the trade that ever actually came from Roman shores to India. We have all these fascinating details about like even the names of Roman ships have survived. We know that, for example, one ship was called, I think, Lupa, which means she-wolf. We know of another ship that was called Isis. We know of great merchant families, banking families based in Rome. And we know of the wine industry from the Roman perspective. We know of these massive orchards where grapes were raised. We know of thousands of slaves who were put to work, harvesting these grapes, caring for them, pressing them into wine, looking after their fermentation, all that. And these slaves would have been captured by Rome in wars that could have gone as far away as Britain. So essentially what you're telling me is that these networks that Muziris was connected to was so vast that they stretched all the way from Britain in the west to China in the east. And that is absolutely crazy. It is essentially, it's probably one of India's very earliest global cities in a way, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it just never ceases to blow my mind that all this was possible with fairly rudimentary technology. These people were literally at the mercy of the oceans, the guys who were crossing the seas to come here. And you really have to think about the human stories that were involved in all of this.
Oh yeah, definitely.
There's endless potential for for imagining the worlds that these people inhabited, the material, social, cultural worlds. The example you gave of was toddy looked down upon now that wine was available is so fascinating. I would also like counter that with, were the people who were growing the pepper in the Western Ghats looking down upon the rich people in Pattinam who were selling off their pepper at massive profits and like getting wine from Jordan?
Probably, you had probably had sort of resentment.
So that's absolutely fascinating. That's.
But what also really fascinates me is that the sort of cultural exchanges that are happening at that point, because you bought in probably slaves from Britain and stuff like that, right? So I mean, and if you're trading, you need to know the language. So like for me, in my head, the way that it's a little juvenile, but like the way that translates, like there's probably ancient inhabitant of Tamilagam. And like, I mean, if you want to go by the stereotype of South Indians as being dark-skinned and stuff like that, fine, take it. Like, it's just more fascinating to me that probably like a South Indian Dravidian human being at that point is interacting, is talking in Roman, is in Latin and stuff like that.
Latin, yeah.
And someone's talking in Chinese. Like, maybe there's like someone from Tamilagam in Rome. Like, like that's like a very like, what is...
Certainly possible.
Yeah, like it's very interesting to me that, that sort of like, cultural migration is happening at that time. And like, I mean, as if that's not enough, we also do know that I think a little bit north of Muziris, there's supposed to have been a temple dedicated to Augustus.
That's okay. Now I can go on a whole rant about this. And it's since you actually brought up this cultural exchange, let me just very briefly tell our listeners, at least those of you who have so kindly remained with us up to this point in the podcast, that there is evidence that Roman art or Roman artisans, or at least Roman art, reached as far along India's east coast as the Amaravati Stupa in Andhra Pradesh. Which is absolutely nuts. You'd never expect that Roman art and culture had actually reached that part of the subcontinent. And like, there's really so much that can be said about Rome's interaction with India, but we're more or less out of time for today. Thank you so much, Aditya, for this fascinating conversation. There is really so much that can be said about Muziris. I hope that our listeners manage to get a deeper perspective on how Muziris and more generally South India fits into the grand scheme of the emergence of the global economy. Thank you so much, Aditya, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure being on here,
Always a pleasure talking to you, man.
I wish we could like talk a little bit more, but I'm sure like we lost 90% of the listeners by that point.
We will have you back. We will have you back sooner rather than later to talk more about South Indian archaeology and really what the material evidence read in conjunction with the texts tell us about South India's fascinating place in the world. Now, on that note, thank you once again for joining us, and thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila_INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, TheWholeTruthFoods.com, and Seat Tires. We really do appreciate the support. So the last year's been tough for all of us, and the second wave of COVID really hit us badly. To help those affected by the pandemic in India, the podcasting community has come together under the Pod for Change banner to raise funds through an exclusive NGO partner, Give India. Join IVM and Pod for Change as we look to make a positive impact in the life of those affected by COVID-19. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and remember, somebody could really use the help. And now back to the promo. On the Simplified podcast, the gang explains the oxygen crisis happening in the country and tells us the various measures being taken to tackle it. On States of Anarchy, Hamsani Hariharan talks about how the geopolitical relationships shaped COVID response and the world order. As Indians, we're all familiar with acid reflux or heartburn, given the spicy food we consume. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has some simple solutions to counter that. Vatsama Moria explores the iconic neighborhood of Dadar and tells us its connection to outer space in Postcards from Nowhere. It was Dangle time on The Fighting Goat, as hosts Somesh and Arjun were joined by unbeaten MMA fighter and Commonwealth gold medalist Ritu Fogart. The traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh shares examples of various innovations that came up during the COVID times and helped us deal with the situation. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Whether you're an established sports person or a budding one, or simply a sports enthusiast, join us, Tanvi and Shlok.
We are two passionate pro badminton players talking policy, mindset, and everything sport.
So tune in to the Millennial Athlete every Monday.
Only on the IVM Podcast Network.
Trust us, it's gonna be lit.